Dear listeners, welcome to Insights with Dr. Jen. I'm your host, Dr. Jennifer Huang. Today, we are going to talk about a topic that is both personal and professional for me, the bamboo ceiling. Why don't we see more East Asians like Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans in top leadership roles in Western companies? This topic came up after an interesting conversation of me with an international company HR. She invited me to speak at their China headquarters to motivate and encourage their Chinese employees to take on more leadership roles by sharing my own career development and working experience. Their ultimate goal is to bring more Chinese voices or even Asia Pacific voices into their global headquarters for decision-making process because they think that Asian business in total already over one-third of the business of the company, but they don't have even one senior C-suite manager in the top management. So that's how they want to see the company develop. At the first, I was not sure why they asked me to talk because I often get invitation to discuss about finance or personal wealth management, but not much about career development. I am not a career expert or a cross-cultural specialist. I am only a person who had over 20 years business world experience. But then the HR manager told me that exactly why she invited me, because she believed my international working experience could provide very convincing insights and talking points for their colleagues. Because most of academia or professors who are looking into the cultural difference or the career development belong to another different world from our business world. Especially, she said, she highlighted that I worked for UK company and US association as a board member, but also in Chinese company as a senior manager in the executive team, have this good balance or contrast to understand what is Western firm require and also how the Eastern or the local Chinese firm operate. How do I feel the difference? Which firm appreciate what kind of the quality? So my own examples or experience can really provide some concrete practical advice and suggestions for their Chinese team. So after giving it a thought, and I decided to do some research and look into this question because my personal experience can be quite limited, although I worked for companies and in 4 different countries, but it is still personal experience. As a PhD and a researcher, now I know that for a lot of researchers, who are actually focusing on their time to discuss and to look into those type of social questions using more data-based, evidence-based, and scientific method to provide insights. So I will plan this topic into 2 episodes. In the first episodes today, I'm going to share 2 research papers I found to look into the East Asia and the South Asians in Western business. They actually raise up a very interesting question. It's not all Asians are lacking in the development of the top company roles, but compared with South Asians, East Asians are less represented in the CEO or C-suites in the multinational companies. We all know that Indians, for example, are very famous as the CEOs in multinational companies, such as, on top of my mind, Microsoft, Pepsi Cola Company. They both have the very famous Indian CEOs who are quite successful. In the second episode, I will talk about my own personal experience as a career developing from the country manager to the business director and to the board member in the US association. So I will also share with you my top 3 advice based on my own failures or my own achievement to build a successful international career. Now let's get started. Before I introduce the 2 research papers, I want to talk about Asia because as an Asian myself, I always thinking, US is leading the global economy, but the data show that in 2024, actually, Asia's global share of the GDP is more than half. It is now 54% contribution to the global GDP, more than US and Europe, also Africa combined. Especially China has developed so fast that now they have 128 companies listed in Fortune Global 500 list, and only 11 less than US, which is 139 companies. This is surprising fact. I never know that. So some even call this is an Asian century. But here's a catch. You might think there must be a lot of business leaders from China or East Asian background. But based on a 2024 Harvard Business Review study, despite Asian making up around 13% of US professional workforce, they hold only 1.5% of corporate officer roles in Fortune 500 companies. And when it comes to Asian women, the disparity is even more striking. They make up less than 1% of promotions into the C-suite. What's even more alarming is that more than half of Fortune 1000 company boards have no single Asian directors at all. So even though Asians are well represented in the workforce, they are clearly missing at the top level of leadership. Now, here is where it gets interesting. Among the Asian groups, we have East Asians like Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. They are actually falling behind the South Asians, particularly Indians, when it comes to leadership position in S&P 500 companies. For example, East Asians only make up about 1 to 2% of CEOs in the S&P 500, while South Asians, especially Indians, are represented at around 3 to 4% of CEO position in these companies, almost doubled the East Asian background managers. Off the top of my head, some famous Indian CEOs that come into my mind are the leaders of Microsoft, YouTube, Google, IBM, Adobe, Starbucks, and FedEx, and of course, Indra Nooyi of PepsiCo. I can remember her name because she is one of the few women CEOs that actually broke barriers in a male-dominated business space. On the East Asian side, I can remember and recall one very famous example, Jason Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, the graphics chip maker leading the change in the AI era. I remember him for his humorous and inspirational talks. He is definitely not the typical East Asian CEO. In Chinese culture, leadership is often more about reserved communication and very modest and quiet. But Jason, he is absolutely the opposite. He is outgoing, charismatic, and has that energy always draws people in. As Forbes once said, he combines the precision of a technologist with the flair of a Hollywood director. When you listen to his speech is so exciting and full of energy. Obviously, he is not someone you come across every day, and yes, he is Chinese, but a very non-traditional Chinese business leader.
From ashes deep I start my climb, a fire birthed in darkest time, glimmering through the night I soar, unleashing strength unseen before.
Well, Jason Huang is an exceptional Chinese. Overall, South Asians seem to be securing more top positions compared to their East Asian counterparts in the S&P 500. So what's going on here? Why is there such a big difference? You may think of several reasons, such as personal ambitions, social prejudice, communication styles, or even stereotypes or bias that hold by the society on kind of the leadership people expect. But which of these factors really matter? To dig deeper, I would like to introduce my AI assistants, Johnny and Amy, to discuss an interesting paper titled Why East Asians but Not South Asians Are Underrepresented in Leadership Positions in the United States. This research looks into three key factors and finds that it's not prejudice or personal ambitions at play. Rather, the key differentiator seems to be assertiveness in communication, which makes South Asians more successful in leadership roles compared to East Asian. Now, let's hear their conversations about the detailed findings.
Welcome to the deep dive. We're diving into a topic today that you might have heard of, the bamboo ceiling. This is that invisible barrier that supposedly keeps Asians from rising in the ranks in corporate America. But what if I told you it's a bit more complicated than that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
You ready to kind of challenge some assumptions?
Absolutely. I think the reality is that it's not just about all Asians having the same experience. The research we'll be looking at today actually reveals some pretty interesting differences between East Asians and South Asians when it comes to leadership.
Okay, so we're already breaking down this monolith idea that all Asian professionals have the same experience.
Yeah.
We're seeing that East Asian and South Asian professionals don't necessarily have the same paths when it comes to leadership positions. What's the evidence?
Yeah. So one really striking piece of evidence is a study that looked at 8 years of data from CEOs of S&P 500 companies. And this is, pretty compelling because it's focusing on the very top.
Yeah.
The top of the corporate world.
Right.
And what they found was a significant difference in representation between East Asian and South Asian CEOs.
Okay, so at the CEO level of the S&P 500, we're seeing this disparity between these two groups.
Yes, and I mean, the numbers are pretty stark. On average, there were only about 3 or 4 East Asian CEOs per year, compared to over 10 South Asian CEOs.
Wow.
And here's the real kicker. The ratio of South Asian CEOs to their population in the U.S. was actually higher than that of white Americans.
Oh, wow. That is surprising. I mean, you often hear about the challenges that minorities face in reaching those top leadership positions, but this suggests there's a lot more nuance to the story, right?
Absolutely. And to really understand this nuance, I think we need to kind of zoom out a little bit, go beyond just those CEO positions and look at, senior leadership roles across different industries.
Okay.
And that's where some of these large-scale surveys of Asian employees in major U.S. companies come in.
So it's not just a CEO thing. We see this difference in leadership even when we zoom out and look at a wider range of leadership roles.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that this pattern persists even when you control for factors that you might think would matter. Things like birthplace, education level, even English fluency.
So it's not birthplace, it's not education,
Yeah.
It's not language skills. This difference in leadership representation persists even after we kind of control for all those factors.
Yeah.
So now I'm really curious, what could be driving this? What could be causing this disparity?
Well, one initial thought might be that, maybe East Asians are just less motivated to pursue leadership roles, right?
Mm.
But actually, that assumption is debunked by the research.
So you mean to tell me that the stereotype that East Asians are kind of content in these technical roles and not really aspiring to lead is just flat out wrong?
The data suggests that, yeah.
Okay.
The surveys found no significant difference in work motivation or even leadership motivation specifically between East Asian and South Asian professionals. So if it's not about drive or ambition, then we have to look elsewhere for an explanation.
You've got me really curious now. So if it's not motivation, then what's the missing piece of this puzzle?
Right.
What does the research point to?
Well, the research points to a really fascinating cultural factor, assertiveness,
Oh, interesting.
and how this trait plays out in the American workplace.
Okay, so you're saying that assertiveness, or how people communicate their ideas or how they advocate for themselves, could be a factor in this whole Bambi ceiling conversation. Help me understand how this connects with East Asian and South Asian experiences.
Yeah, so think about how leadership is often perceived, especially in American corporate culture.
Right.
It's often associated with, being outspoken, confident, able to really take charge. But East Asian cultures often emphasize different values,
Right.
Things like humility, harmony, and avoiding confrontation.
Okay, so in a U.S. work environment that often prizes, a more direct and outspoken style of communication, those East Asian cultural norms might not be as readily understood or appreciated.
Exactly. That's exactly what the research suggests. And it's interesting to contrast this with South Asian cultures, where there's actually a long tradition of debate and argumentation. I don't know if you've ever heard of Amartya Sen, but he wrote a whole book about it called The Argumentative Indian.
Oh, yeah.
Where he really explores this aspect of South Asian culture. And this kind of background might actually align more naturally with the American expectation of what a leader, quote unquote, sound like.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm starting to see how this cultural lens could shed some light on those leadership differences that we talked about earlier. But I'm sure some of our listeners are thinking, hold on a second, what about prejudice? We can't just ignore that.
Of course.
We can't just ignore the role of bias and discrimination, right?
Yeah, prejudice exists, and it would be naive to say that it plays no role.
Right.
But here's a finding that I think complicates the picture. South Asians, who, as we've seen, are more likely to be in leadership positions, actually report experiencing greater prejudice than East Asians.
Wait, that's fascinating. So you're telling me that the group that's more successful in reaching leadership roles is also the group that reports higher levels of prejudice. That seems counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it? But it suggests that prejudice, while certainly a factor, may not be the primary barrier to leadership for East Asians. If it were, then wouldn't we expect South Asians to be facing greater obstacles?
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. If prejudice were the main culprit, we wouldn't see this pattern where South Asians are both experiencing more prejudice and achieving greater leadership representation. So it forces us to really consider other factors that might be at play.
Right.
What are some of the explanations that the research offers for this seemingly paradoxical finding?
Well, research suggests a couple of possibilities. One is appearance-based bias. South Asians, especially after 9/11, have been subject to a specific kind of scrutiny and discrimination, often based on how they look, how they dress,
Right. So it's not just about being a minority. It's about being a minority that's visibly identifiable and subject to certain stereotypes, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
This adds another layer of complexity.
It does. And the takeaway here is not to diminish the reality of prejudice, but I think to highlight that it's not the whole story. There are other factors, including, as we've seen, these cultural differences in communication styles that may be contributing to those differences in leadership representation.
It seems like we need to keep unpacking this to really understand what's going on. You mentioned earlier that there's another example that kind of sheds light on this whole assertiveness thing. Something about MBA students, right?
Yes. So this example takes us to the world of a top business school where you might expect a level playing field.
Okay, let's dive into that. This sounds like it could be really interesting.
Yeah, so they looked at leadership among MBA students
Okay.
who all went through the same, rigorous admissions process.
Yeah.
So you'd think in this kind of setting, everyone would have an equal shot, right?
Right.
But even here, a familiar pattern emerged.
A familiar pattern, you mean?
Fewer East Asians held leadership roles compared to both South Asian and white students. And once again, assertiveness emerged as a key factor.
So even in a top business school, with everyone having comparable qualifications, potential, this difference still shows up. How did they measure assertiveness in this context?
They used peer ratings. So they basically asked students to evaluate each other on various leadership qualities. And guess what? East Asian students were consistently rated as less assertive compared to their South Asian and white peers.
Okay, so this is starting to feel like a recurring theme here.
Mhm.
You're saying that even in a highly competitive and selective environment, like a top business school, where everyone is presumably very driven and ambitious, East Asian students are perceived as less assertive.
Yeah.
And this perception seems to be linked to their lower representation in those leadership roles.
That's right. And it really underscores the importance of understanding how these cultural differences and communication styles can have a real impact on leadership opportunities.
Yeah.
Even in settings where, you might expect those differences to be less pronounced.
This is really eye-opening. It challenges a lot of assumptions about what it takes to succeed in leadership roles, especially in the U.S. So to recap what we've learned so far, we see this clear distinction in leadership representation between East Asians and South Asians. And this difference isn't explained by things like, birthplace or education or even motivation. Instead, assertiveness, viewed through a cultural lens, seems to be a more significant factor than we might have initially thought.
Right. And the implications of this are pretty profound.
Yeah.
It suggests that we might be missing out on a whole pool of talent by clinging too tightly to a very specific and arguably culturally biased view of what a leader should be.
That's a really important point. What if we're overlooking the strengths of other leadership approaches simply because they don't fit the traditional mold? We've got to dig into that next.
Absolutely. Let's explore that further.
It makes you wonder if we're really limiting ourselves by sticking to just one narrow definition of leadership. Like, are we missing out on some amazing potential by only rewarding those who are always, so outspoken, always taking charge?
Yeah, it's a really good question. What if we started valuing other qualities, like the ability to collaborate, to mentor others, to make thoughtful decisions? These are all things that, are often associated with East Asian leadership styles, and they're so essential in today's world.
Yeah, and I've definitely noticed that the old command and control style of leadership doesn't always work so well anymore. Things are changing so quickly these days. You need people who can adapt, who can work together.
Exactly. In a world that demands, agility, collaboration, and emotional intelligence, having that wider range of leadership styles is essential. It's not just like a nice bonus.
Yeah.
I think it's really a necessity for success these days.
So if we're just focused on one type of leader, we're doing ourselves a disservice, right? Like we're putting all our eggs in one basket. But what does this mean for people out there listening? How can we actually use this? Apply these insights?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's about awareness. We need to recognize that this whole idea of the bamboo ceiling, it's not a simple issue.
Right.
And that different Asian groups face different unique challenges.
So it's not enough to just say, we need more Asian leaders. We need to understand the nuances, right? And the complexities of their experiences.
Right. And for those of us who aren't East Asian, I think it's a good time to really examine our own biases. Do we automatically assume that someone's competent just because they're assertive?
Right.
Do we favor leaders who fit a certain mold, even if that mold is, maybe outdated?
Those are tough questions.
They are.
But they're important ones.
Yeah.
I mean, we all have unconscious biases, and, being aware of them is the first step to creating a workplace that's truly inclusive.
Absolutely. And for our East Asian listeners, I think it's important to acknowledge the challenges that they may face in a system that doesn't always recognize their strengths.
Right. And you might even feel pressure, like to conform to a communication style that just doesn't come naturally.
Yeah.
It's like you're being told you have to be someone you're not to succeed.
Exactly. And that can be, incredibly stressful, incredibly demoralizing.
Yeah.
But remember, there are ways to adapt, ways to kind of bridge those cultural differences.
Right.
Think about, communication training, finding mentors, or even connecting with allies who champion diverse leadership styles.
And don't be afraid to embrace your cultural values. Those are a source of strength. They're not something to be ashamed of.
Exactly. And in fact, they can lead to really unique and effective leadership approaches.
And for any organizations out there listening, this research is a real wake-up call. If you want to attract top talent, retain top talent, if you want to build a culture that's truly innovative and inclusive, it's time to rethink that narrow definition of leadership.
right? Think about the potential. What if we expand our definition of leadership to embrace, a wider range of communication styles, cultural values? I mean, it could be a game changer.
Yeah, I love that. It's not about like fitting into a box. It's about recognizing and valuing those unique strengths that each individual brings to the table.
Imagine, what if we started valuing things like humility, active listening, and a focus on building consensus?
Those are often seen as soft skills, but they are so essential for effective leadership, especially in a world that's constantly changing.
Absolutely. And let's be honest, the traditional command and control leadership, it just doesn't cut it anymore.
It feels so outdated, doesn't it?
Right?
Yeah.
In a world that demands agility and collaboration, emotional intelligence, we need to embrace a much wider range of approaches to leadership. It's not just like a nice thing to do, it's a necessity.
So as we kind of wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave you with something to think about. What would happen if, instead of trying to fit into this pre-existing mold, East Asian professionals really embraced their unique cultural strength and redefined what it means to be a leader in America?
I mean, could this lead to a more inclusive, a more dynamic leadership landscape?
Yeah.
Could it even unlock, this wave of innovation and creativity that we haven't even begun to tap into?
Those are great questions. I feel like we're just scratching the surface here. And for our listeners who want to explore this further, we'll include links to all the research that we've talked about today in the show notes, so definitely check those out.
Definitely. Remember, challenging our assumptions about leadership is the first step toward creating a more equitable and successful future, I think, for everyone.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
Yeah, it's exciting to think about what could happen if we start redefining leadership in a way that embraces those qualities. It could change the game completely. So what are some ways that organizations could actually put this into practice? What could they actually do?
That's a great question. I mean, it's one thing to talk about, broadening our definition of leadership. It's another to actually do it. I think one concrete step that organizations can take is to incorporate a wider range of perspectives into their leadership development programs.
Okay. So instead of just focusing on the classic leadership traits,
Right.
they should expose their emerging leaders to all these different styles and approaches. Exactly. Yeah. Imagine a program where participants, they learn about the strengths of collaborative leadership, where they study how effective leaders can build consensus, how they empower their teams. They could even bring in, successful leaders from diverse backgrounds to share their experiences, share their insights.
I love that idea. It's like giving people a toolbox filled with all these different leadership tools and strategies.
Yeah.
So they can kind of choose the ones that fit their personality, that fit the situation.
Exactly. And it also sends a really powerful message to employees.
Right.
That the organization values different perspectives, different approaches to leadership. It shows that they're committed to creating a truly inclusive culture.
So it's not just about training individuals.
Right.
It's about changing the culture of the organization.
Absolutely. And that takes time. That takes effort. But I think it's an investment worth making. Organizations that embrace this kind of cultural shift are likely to see some really, real tangible benefits. Things like, increased innovation, better decision-making, improved employee morale and engagement.
It sounds like a win-win, right?
Yeah.
Individuals feel valued and empowered. Organizations become more adaptable, more successful.
Exactly. It's about unlocking the full potential of, everyone in the organization.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We started by talking about the bamboo ceiling and the surprising differences in leadership representation between East Asian and South Asian professionals. We talked about assertiveness and cultural values and how those might be contributing to these disparities. And we talked about the need for organizations to broaden their definition of leadership and create a more inclusive culture that values a wider range of styles, a wider range of approaches.
It's been a fascinating conversation.
It really has. And for our listeners who are, interested in learning more about this, we've included links to the research we discussed in the show notes, so be sure to check those out.
Yeah, definitely. I think, challenging our assumptions about leadership is really the first step toward creating a more equitable and successful future for everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us today on The Deep Dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible.